into the chat box and select Send to all panellists, or you can type your question through the Q&A chat box. That's both the same, I think. We will try and get through as many questions as possible at the end of the presentation, but don't worry, any questions we can't get to today, we will provide some written commentary for you on the website when we upload the webinars. On with the show today. We're very fortunate that a number of our presenters from the symposium have kindly made themselves available to present their presentation again, and we thank them all very much for doing so. I'll now introduce Anna Clarkson, today's presenter. Anna Clarkson is a clinical psychologist and a principal consultant with Sentis. Sentis is a safety consulting firm which partners with organisations in Australia and around the world to improve their performance through building a safer, more engaged and aligned workforce. Their focus is on applying psychological know-how to shift attitudes so that workers are engaging with safety because they want to and not because they have to. Through this work, Anna enjoys helping organisations understand their safety culture, build safety leadership capacity and develop individual personal motivation to engage in safety. She's pleased today to share some of Sentis's international research on safety culture and safety leadership, which gives us some powerful insights into how we might better lead everyone home safely and prevent MSDs. So I'll now hand over to Anna and we'll get started. Thank you.
Thank you, Suzanne and Workplace Health and Safety Queensland for having me. It's a great opportunity to share again some really interesting research on the state of safety leadership around the world so that we can learn a little bit more about what works in driving safety performance and where our areas of opportunity are to develop a stronger leadership capacity in our organisation so that we can prevent those musculoskeletal injuries. The research that I'm sharing with you is available for free in our ebook on our website, so please feel welcome to download that ebook. Once we've finished the presentation, I'll show you the link of where to find it. Before I jump into the research, let's set the scene as to why investigating safety leadership is so important. Our experience working with organisations over the last few decades tells us that workplaces have done some really good work actually in improving their environmental controls and developing safe work practices for employees to follow. And this has led to a substantial reduction in the number of incidents that are occurring out there. However, whilst there's been a downwards trend in the number of incidents, people are still getting hurt at work, and many organisations describe their safety performance as levelling out and perhaps hitting a bit of a plateau. So many leaders tell us that they're scratching their heads wondering kind of why this is happening and why they can't get that last percentage of people on board and working safely and preventing that smaller percentage of injuries that are still occurring. Particularly when they are investing so well in their safety management system and are telling their employees what to do to work safely. So, what is the missing link? If we're investing well in our environment and we're investing well in our practices, how come we have hit that safety plateau? What is missing in our investments so far? Well, we would argue that it's an investment in people, in the way they think, the decisions they make, their engagement and their capacity to influence others. We know that over 90% of incidents are caused, at least in part, by the decision a person makes at the time that actually puts them at risk. So let's explore briefly how that person factor works and what this has to do with leadership. Here we have a basic psychological model which explains why we get certain results in life, and it's called the ABR model. It's nice and simple. We all hold attitudes about things in life, about our job, our boss, our family, and about safety. And those thoughts and feelings then inspire certain behaviours. Now those behaviours then contribute to the results that we get. So take the example of someone's attitudes towards a risk assessment. If someone believes that risk assessments are a tool they can use to invest in their safety, then they're much more likely, when they're doing that risk assessment, to be engaged in looking around for hazards and planning the controls to put in place. Now, as a result, they're much more likely to reduce the level of risk in that task. So, for example, if I believe that I'm pushing or pulling a trolley which has some heavy equipment on it, in fact that equipment is too heavy for my back, for my load, then I'll get some other mechanical aids to support me or get some other people to help me to do that task more safely. If, however, the worker believes that the risk assessments are a waste of time, they're just there to cover the boss's backside, then we probably say that was a fairly hindering attitude towards safety. And in this case, the worker is more likely to engage in that risk assessment as a bit of a tick and flick exercise, which means they may miss the fact that the load on that trolley has increased and there's a potential increase in the risk to their back by pushing or pulling that trolley along. So this means that they are much more likely to have an increased risk of a muscular strain or injury, which is a pretty bad result. Now, what role does the leader play in influencing the attitudes and behaviours and, in fact, the results of their team? Well, of course, it's quite significant. The safety climate of a team is very much linked to the quality of safety leadership. Let's see how this works. We'll contrast two styles of leadership. Imagine the impact of leader A, who takes the time to look at and recognise quality risk assessments, versus leader B, who puts them in a pile somewhere just to collect dust. Now, if I pay little attention to the risk assessments, what attitude does that role model to my team? Probably that risk assessments aren't terribly important. Imagine the impact of leader A, who voices regularly why risk assessments are worthwhile and how they can help us to get home to our families, in contrast to leader B, who tells their staff to do their risk assessment because there's a quota we have to meet to get our bonuses. So imagine how these two different leaders affect their team's attitudes towards safety. Clearly, leader A is going to drive safer attitudes and behaviours through their role modelling and explanation of why the safety processes in the business are important, rather than leader B, who is more likely to see a higher level of risk in their team. So leadership is a critical component of the overall safety culture. Leaders set they have really the biggest influence on the attitudes and behaviours that each person in their workforce holds towards both the environment and the safe work practices. So as a part of the total investment in safety culture, leadership, of course, is really critical. Now, just as a point of reflection, perhaps it's worth thinking for yourself, where is your organisation investing most of your efforts? Is it in the environment, in the practices? Is it in the personal attitudes and motivations of your staff, or is it in leadership? Now, if, like many organisations we speak to, they are investing heavily in the practices and environment part, now's a good opportunity to reflect on how you may better invest in your people and your leadership. So we've set the scene for why leadership is important. It drives the attitudes and behaviours that deliver safer results. Let's now learn more about the research we did on the state of safety leadership in Australia and around the world. In this project, we looked at the data of over 8,000 employees around the world to determine trends in how employees perceive their leaders. And this gives us some useful information about the state of safety leadership and where we ought to focus our learning and development activities. In this study, we asked employees about their perceptions of their leaders. So whilst we didn't observe these leaders in the field ourselves, it's important to note that the employee's perception of their leader is in fact their reality. We analysed survey results of staff who completed our safety climate survey, which is part of a diagnostic we do around safety culture, in our client organisations around the world, in Africa, Australia, USA, Middle East, etc. And you can see here the data set has a pretty good representation of many high-risk industries, including agriculture, mining, industrial services, manufacturing, etc. As part of our safety climate survey, employees were asked to rate their leaders on 8 safety leadership competencies. Now you can see them there in the slide, and these have been derived from the literature about what leadership behaviours drive a high-performing safety culture. So they are recognising, actively caring, collaborating, demonstrating a safety vision, inspiring the team to follow them, role modelling, challenging and supporting. In this next slide, you can see a definition of the different competencies. So we've got challenging, which is about challenging team members to think about safety issues and scenarios differently. So the classic question here is there a better and safer way for us to do that task? Vision, of course, is sharing the safety goals for the team. Recognising is about rewarding employees based on the achievement of high safety performance. Supporting means that we're providing active monitoring of safety performance and compliance with safety standards. Collaborating means that we're seeking input and using the expertise of our team when we're making safety decisions. Inspiring is about inspiring the team to achieve the vision, so getting some followership within our team and getting a personal reason for why it's worth investing in safety. Role modelling is about, of course, walking the talk. And actively caring is about not only caring about employees, but actively showing that you care through your conversations with them, by tailoring the safety message to the individuals in your team, etc. So now it's time to reflect on your experience. And we're going to do a quick multi-choice poll. We're going to ask you to consider which of the following do you feel is the biggest area of strength in safety leaders around the world when thinking about those 8 leadership competencies. So we have a multiple choice polling question there for you to consider which do you think to be the biggest area of strength in safety leadership around the world? Recognising, role modelling, showing active care, or perhaps challenging staff to think differently about safety. So I'll give you a moment to put in your responses because we'd love to hear what you expect the research to tell us. I'll just give you a few moments to fill out that poll and we'll get the results and I'll feed that back to you. I can see those answers coming in. Thank you. All right, we'll close up that poll. I'll just get those results for you. We won't be a moment.
Role modelling 33, recognising 22, no answer 22, active care 15, and challenging 15. So most people said role modelling.
Great, thank you so much for participating in our poll. So the results are that 33% of you thought that role modelling would be the strongest safety leadership competency around the world, and that makes a lot of sense because that's one of those kind of practical things, isn't it, that we do to demonstrate good safety leadership, is to walk the talk. So I'm not surprised by your answer there, that makes sense to me. Followed closely by 22% of you who thought recognising would be the strongest safety leadership competency, followed by 15% thinking active care was, and then finally 15% thought challenging was. So that's really interesting. I'm going to share with you what the research told us were the highest competencies in a moment, but let's just keep that thought in mind, that we thought that role modelling was probably the highest competency around the world. So let's do a second poll. And this one I would like you to think about here is, what do you see as being the biggest area of opportunity for safety leaders around the world? So which one are they likely to score lowest on? Again, the same four are presented for you to choose between recognising, role modelling, active care and challenging. And your answers will be recorded on the poll. Thank you for participating. I'd love to hear your feedback. Hi. All right, so we've got the results of the poll in. It sounds as though most of you believe that the highest area of opportunity for leaders is to demonstrate active care, followed by challenging their staff, followed by role modelling, and then the last one you thought was recognising. So that's really interesting. Let's keep that in mind. So you thought the strength for leaders is role modelling, and the area of opportunity is active care. Great. So this is just now a question for you to consider yourself. You're welcome to type in the Q&A area what you believe to be the answer to this question. Otherwise, just answer it yourself. So I'm going to ask you to think about what percentage of leaders out there around the world do you feel strongly demonstrate safety leadership? What percentage? Well, our research results revealed that only 1 in 4 leaders demonstrate strong safety leadership. And so when considering both upwards ratings from employees, so the employee is rating their direct leader, as well as the leader rating themselves, we found about 25% of leaders were demonstrating strong safety leadership. So this means that we have an opportunity here to greatly improve our safety leadership, and in doing so, lift that safety plateau that so many organisations are concerned about. So to get a sense of where we should be spending our time when investing in leadership, let's look at the overall breakdown of results. So let's see how well leaders are doing across each of the 8 safety leadership competencies. And that way we know which competencies we can further strengthen and which need more investment in our learning and development initiatives. Now, the first thing to take stock of here is how positive or negative the perceptions are of leaders overall. So you can see the 3 colour bands here. If leaders are scoring in the red zone, it's a negative perception. In the orange zone, a fair perception, and in the green zone, a positive perception. So where do we see most of the competencies being rated? Well, as you can see, it's in that orange zone. So leaders are perceived by their staff as showing fair levels of safety leadership. They lead strongly some of the time is the key descriptor here. So this means that either there are particular skills within that competency that leaders aren't very confident or competent in delivering, or perhaps it's just inconsistent delivery of those skills. So there's an opportunity here to coach leaders to be more skillful and be more consistent in their application of these safety leadership competencies. Now, the second thing to learn from this graph is which competencies were rated as relative strengths or relative opportunities. Now, you said in our poll that the competency that most leaders would perform better at was role modelling. And yet our research showed actually the strength was active care. So that's a bit contrary to your expectation, because you actually thought that would be probably the biggest area of opportunity. So this is a bit of a surprising result for us, isn't it? It's counterintuitive. And I think that's what's so interesting about this research, is that it gives us data that we didn't necessarily anticipate. And that's the beauty of doing studies like this. So looking at the colour banding here, we can see that leaders are seen as genuinely caring for their teams, at least to some extent. And I'm heartened, at least, that our leaders out there are seen to be caring for their teams, because that's a really great starting point, because we can't really fake that very well. But a word of caution here, just because we care, it doesn't mean that we have the tools to demonstrate that care effectively and to utilise that care to lead a team towards safe work and to challenge each other on our attitudes and recognise when we're doing well. Now let's speak about the elephant in the room, the big red result there. This represents the lowest scoring safety leadership competency, which you thought actually would be active care. Now in fact, it was recognising, and this is the one that you thought probably would be okay. So this tells us that out of all of the leadership competencies, leaders apply the skills of recognising positive safety performance the least. Now that's quite surprising. We thought this was a really curious finding and not quite what we expected. So we started to ask more questions about this result. So the first question we asked was, did it matter where the organisation was located in the world? So for example, were there differences between countries, which might be explained by cultural expectations or something. Having a look at the trend there, you can see actually no, most countries are following the same pattern of safety leadership. Whilst there's some differences between countries, overall the pattern is pretty universal, isn't it? And in particular, if you have a look at the result for recognising, it's universally the lowest performing competency, which is really interesting. And active caring is universally pretty much the highest competency. So, okay, so location doesn't explain the results. Let's have a look at industry breakdown. So we asked ourselves, did it matter what industry the employee was in? Because perhaps people have different cultures based on the industry they work in. Now, again, we looked at the pattern of results, and whilst some industries may be performing slightly differently than others in terms of their safety leadership, overall the trend is the same. So universally across industry, recognising is still by far the lowest rated competency in safety leadership. And whilst there are differences between industries, the overall pattern remains the same. So what about how long the employee doing the rating has been in the job? Well, again, the overall pattern is the same. But if you've been in your workplace for less than 1 year, you're more likely to see your leader as giving more recognition. And this is interesting. Why might it be the case that someone who's a little green sees their leader as more likely to praise and encourage their safety performance? Well, our theory is that perhaps it's young and new workers who either perceive recognition to be happening more than it is, or that they're receiving more recognition and feedback because they're learning. And maybe they're even seeking out recognition more often as they require more feedback on how they're going. So if we were to apply the findings here to your workplace, one recommendation might be to give your longer serving employees a little more love. Give them a bit of a pat on the back for their experience and influence in driving a positive safety culture, because we know that the newer employees are perceiving they get more recognition than the ones who've been there longer. And finally, we looked at any differences between perceptions of safety leadership based on what position you held in the organisational structure. So that is, we're looking at, did frontline workers perceive their supervisor to be better at recognition, for example, than the supervisor saw their boss, the superintendent, or the superintendent saw their manager. And here you can see that regardless of position, recognition is still the lowest rated, but that recognition is perceived as occurring more frequently the higher you go up the chain in the organisational structure, with senior managers being seen as giving more recognition than frontline leaders. So why is it that frontline workers rate frontline leaders as worse at recognising them than the middle or senior management? Our experience tells us that many of our frontline leaders have been promoted due to technical competence, and many organisations haven't invested in a lot of formal training in leadership. And so those frontline leaders are often promoted to leadership off the tools and are expected now to be experts in influencing the mindsets and behaviours of their staff. And we all know that leading others requires a different skill set altogether to fixing a diesel engine or operating machinery. So if only humans would work just like machines, right, it'd be a lot easier. So perhaps frontline workers are experiencing that sort of lack of skill and training from their supervisors in leading others. Now the implication here, of course, is to invest in skilling up your frontline leaders in leadership skills. Some organisations are starting to do this and offer their supervisors Cert 4s in frontline leadership and other leadership courses around the soft skills of safety leadership, and these are great initiatives. So why do managers do better at recognition than supervisors? So we suspect that this is because managers are not only more experienced, but they're also more likely to have been exposed to some leadership training or higher education along the way. Having said that though, even those at the top are still on average seem to recognise their staff to some extent. Not to a great extent, they're not in the green zone, they're still only in that middle zone. So all leaders at all levels could do with some investment in recognising their staff. We do what's important to our leader. And how do we know what's important? By what they pay attention to and what they recognise. So let's sum this up. Not only did recognising and rewarding employees for high safety performance score lower than any other competency, it was actually rated at a level that has significant functional impact on culture. 28% you'll see in that diagram are rated in that red zone, which means that they recognise to a little extent at most. So for organisations whose leaders fall into that orange zone and that red zone, which makes up about 72% of the population, these guys are seeing poor to average safety leadership, which means that performance could be detrimental to safety outcomes, which could result in things like misalignment of safety vision and expectations around safety-related decisions, reduced discretionary effort and compliance, reduced willingness to report incidents and hazards, and increased incident frequency and severity. So investing in developing leaders recognising ability provides a potential really good quick win. Think about the impact a little more recognition for doing the right thing might have on the attitudes and behaviours of your staff. Consider how this might influence staff engagement, retention and safety focus. How might this assist your culture to mature? We know from the literature that using reward and recognition increases the frequency of the targeted behaviour by about 30%. So imagine if we consistently hunted the good stuff and merely paid attention to it, showed interest in what our teams are doing safely, and reinforced the attitudes and behaviours that contribute to the culture we want to build. It seems so easy, doesn't it? So why don't we recognise people more? What gets in the way? Let's take a quick poll. I'd like you to be thinking now about what are some of the common barriers for leaders to recognising positive safety performance. Is it lack of motivation? Is it lack of confidence? or skill, or lack of support. Just give you a moment to vote if you haven't voted already. Just collecting those poll results. Okay, so looking at the poll results, it shows us that most of you are feeling that actually a lack of confidence and skill in how to recognise others is the biggest barrier, followed by lack of motivation, so sort of being unaware of the benefits of doing so, then followed by lack of organisational support. And certainly that marries up with my experience, is that a lot of leaders kind of know it's a good idea, but just haven't quite come up with a strategy or a plan about how to recognise their staff and how to do so effectively, and that kind of holds them back from launching into a recognition strategy. So in terms of that confidence and skill, one of the things that may hold leaders back is the attitude that they hold about recognition. I'd like to just share with you some frames or attitudes that you might have heard around site before, and see whether or not you recognise these attitudes. So we've got the first one, belief here that if people are doing a good job, leave them alone. Don't tell people when they're doing well, only when they're not performing. Or why do people need praise? They get paid to do a job and the money should be enough. Treat them mean and keep them keen. So that's a great one for dating, but maybe not for safety leadership. And then finally, praise is only for puppies and children. So if we believe some of these to be true, we're less likely to get involved in a recognition program and thank our staff for safe work. So the first step, of course, in supporting our leaders to get on board with a recognition strategy is just to explore what their attitudes are about recognition itself. The next step to improve recognition for safe work is to develop a smorgasbord of options about how to recognise staff. So it doesn't have to be expensive or time-consuming. Raffling off the big boat for LTI free time is not really what I'm talking about here. We're talking about giving small amounts of recognition in a way that is meaningful to the employee and doing that regularly. So how should we recognise our staff for positive safety performance? We can give people verbal and non-verbal acknowledgement of their efforts. So we can, for example, be thanking them for speaking up about a task that had a safety risk attached to it. We could stop and listen to their suggestions, because nothing gives people a greater sense of feeling puffed up as being heard and having their opinion valued and being seen as an expert in your area. Give them our time. That's a really precious commodity as a leader. So giving your staff time to ask for their input, their ideas, to find out what the challenges are of their job, and showing interest in them as human beings is a fantastic source of recognition. And share genuinely and honestly your appreciation for someone's attitude or behaviour. Now, it's so critical that that recognition is delivered genuinely, because, of course, if the employee sees there's a bit of a mismatch in our tone of voice that says that, you know, perhaps I don't really mean what I say, of course, that recognition will be instantly dismissed. Another way to recognise staff quite creatively is actually to pass on the good news to somebody else, so that that positive feedback gets shared around your site. And the person who did the good deed gets to hear kind of positive gossip about their good work from someone else. So that can be a great way to kind of build a positive culture. Make sure we base our recognition on real data or an observation so that it's credible and it appears fair, and offer recognition either publicly or privately, depending on what the individual prefers. So this takes getting to know your team members, whether there's someone who likes to be out in the spotlight or somebody who would absolutely hate that and much prefer a quiet pat on the back individually. So if you're looking for some tips now on how to improve recognition for safety at work, here's 5 steps that you can take. First, identify the positive safety behaviours you want to see in your team. So it might be I want them to report incidents and near misses more. It might be that I want them to engage more actively in their risk assessments. It might be that I want them to speak up more to their colleagues or demonstrate active care to each other. So identify those couple of safety behaviours you want to see, and make a list of the types of reward and recognition available for you to use. So this might mean speaking to the HR department to find out what recognition systems are available, because there might be things like email systems with the recognition, or there may be money available to be able to spend on small gifts for employees who've gone above and beyond. And there may be other types of recognition strategies that are available for you to hook into. So maybe find out what those are, and also consider the list of reward and recognition that I've mentioned in the previous slide, so that we're considering both tangible and intangible options. Number 3 would be to spend time in the field actively looking for opportunities to recognise individuals for demonstrating the positive behaviours. So it's really hard to recognise our staff in our team for doing the right thing if we're not out there with them on the job, being able to catch them doing the right thing. So this is really about leaders being visible and present with their teams, and being able to hunt for the good stuff. Now, when we change the focus of our lens to being looking for the things that are going well, it's surprising how often we start to see more of that just because we are deliberately tuning our focus into seeing the good things occur. So just changing your mental focus to hunting the good stuff can actually make a really big difference. But make sure you're out there with your team so that you can catch them doing the right thing. Number 4, when you observe positive behaviours, decide on the most appropriate recognition for that individual or team. So this takes, of course, getting to know your team and understanding what it is that they would value most. And then finally, take action to recognise the individual or team as soon as possible. Don't delay the reward or recognition a month, and don't wait until you have a perfect strategy to get started. Get started straight away. Probably the risk is lower to get started than waiting for it to be perfect. So that concludes the presentation per se. I'll hand over to Suzanne now, who will open up to the floor for questions. Thank you.
Thanks, Anna. We do have a couple of questions coming in, so if people just want to hang on for those, it's always good to hear Anna's thoughts on a few of the questions that people, so do feel free to type in some more. At the moment, I guess one of the questions is around that incentivising. You mentioned the big boat. What do you think of those approaches where a big ticket item is used? You hear about groups that are offered, you know, Harbour Bridge climbs and Disneyland. Well, how do you get the balance? Any comments on that, Anna?
Absolutely, yeah. And look, organisations who put these incentives in place have their heart in the right place, I think. They're wanting to reward high safety performance, particularly for a large group of people. I think one of the challenges in providing a big ticket item, like a lottery for a trip to Disneyland or something like that, is that towards the end of the, for example, LTI free time, so let's imagine you've set the goal that if we get to 12 months LTI free, then everybody goes into a lottery to win a great big prize. One of the challenges with that is that as you get closer and closer to the cut-off time, if you're a worker who has been involved in an injury, and it's a significant one that will involve lost time, how likely do you reckon we'd be to put that little notification into our safety officer if we know that that's going to jeopardise the likelihood of all of our colleagues getting to put in for that trip to Disneyland? Yeah? So the challenge here is it usually drives reporting underground. The other issue then is what we often see happening immediately after that prize has been handed out is an increase in the number of injuries as the focus is then shifted. So, yep, we got our 12 months LTI free time. Now we're back to business as usual, and the risk of injury occurs. The risk goes up typically afterwards. So, much better approach to do it smaller, more regular rewards.
We've got another good question here, and it's along that theme, I guess, where you mentioned that 1 in 4 are strong leaders. Does it not just equate that if you're a strong safety leader, are you also just going to be one of those really strong leaders? What's the evidence say there? Can you comment?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and there are many people out in the safety community who would say, look, let's not use the term safety leadership, it's just leadership. And there's a good point to be had about that if you look at those 8 safety leadership competencies, they are competencies that you could apply to any goal. They are what make a good leader. But not all good leaders who are great at influencing production rates apply those same competencies to safety. And as we can see from the way that the population are reporting or describing their leaders, the application of those leadership skills to safety is a big area of opportunity. So we'd say actually the application of those competencies is quite unique and requires specific focus.
I guess one from the floor here, from me actually, being a safety regulator, we have a lot of duties, and I guess I'm wondering how you reconcile fitting in with things that just must be done. We have requirement to consult and collaborate and cooperate, and some of this stuff's really just how good safety should run. And I'm just wondering if you can comment on that sort of big carrot versus stick concept.
Yeah, absolutely, this is important, isn't it? We know that compliance is absolutely critical, and there is an expectation that organisations are enforcing legislation and are making sure they deliver a safe workplace for their employees to work in. So yes, there are things that have to be done, and compliance needs to be monitored and enforced. The trick is if people aren't engaging in the safe work system and we are just using the big stick, the impact that has on culture is that people end up cooperating only out of fear of reprisal rather than wanting to contribute and be part of the safety management system for the right reasons so that we all go home to the people we love. And so what that means is that we actually inadvertently create a culture where more and more monitoring is actually required to keep it stable. And this puts a lot of burden on leaders to be acting as the police, and on the regulator to act as the police in a workplace. Whereas if we are looking to engage and inspire our workforce to do safe work for the right reasons, because there's something in this for me and for my colleagues and for us as a group, then the burden is less, and it's actually much more effective in getting the performance we want.
Thanks, Anna. I think that's probably a good place to finish. I think let's look at how we can reduce the burden and build some of these skills in all our safety leaders and leaders at all levels. So that's all from us. I just want to thank Anna for taking time out of her busy schedule to present again. We're very grateful, and I'm sure hopefully all the participants have picked up a few good tips and tricks and thoughts and insightful findings. Anyway, thanks again for participating in the webinar, and we'd like to just remind you to register for the next ones. We've got another one in June and a couple more in July. If you'd like to access more information on preventing and managing musculoskeletal disorders, please visit our website and click on the Injury Prevention and Safety tab. Otherwise, definitely join us in July for the tips and tricks on MSDs. And your feedback's always going to be valuable, so please take 30 seconds to complete the survey that's going to pop up about now at the end of the webinar. So thanks, goodbye, and hope to talk to you again soon. Bye. I don't know where